Imagine walking into a zoo in the heart of a great Western city at the dawn of the modern age. You expect to see lions, elephants, or creatures from distant lands. Instead, behind iron bars, you find human beings. Men, women, even children alive, breathing, watching you back put on display as if they were part of the animal world. This was not a nightmare or a myth. It was a reality shaped by colonial power, racial ideology, and a deeply flawed belief that some lives were worth less than others. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, human exhibitions became a dark form of public entertainment across Europe and the United States. Black and indigenous people were taken from their homelands and placed in zoos, circuses, and world fairs. They were presented as exotic, primitive, or closer to nature, while visitors were encouraged to see themselves as more advanced, more civilized. So, these displays did not simply reflect ignorance. They were carefully designed to support colonial rule, economic exploitation, depopulation, and the illusion of moral superiority. Crowds gathered, laughed, stared, and pointed. Posters promised discovery and wonder. Behind the scenes, however, were broken lives, stolen identities, cabalisms and unimaginable humiliation. Science, religion, and popular culture often worked together to justify these exhibitions, blurring the line between knowledge and cruelty. What was advertised as education was, in truth, a performance of power. This story is not just about the past. It challenges us to confront how easily prejudice can be normalized when it is wrapped in authority, tradition, or entertainment. Sever's hint. As we begin this journey into one of history's most disturbing chapters, ask yourself, how did the world accept this as normal, and what lessons does it leave behind for us today? If you find value in uncovering hidden histories like this, please support the channel by liking the video, subscribing, and turning on notifications. Your support helps keep these stories alive, so we never forget what humanity is capable of both in cruelty and in growth. Against the backdrop of those human exhibitions where colonial power turned living people into spectacles, the story of Ota Benga stands as one of the most painful and revealing. He was not an abstract symbol or a nameless figure behind bars. He was a man from the Congo Basin, shaped by a homeland of dense forests, rivers, and community, long before the world reduced him to a label. When he arrived in the United States in the early 20th century, he carried with him the weight of personal loss and the invisible scars left by colonial violence in Central Africa, where entire villages were destroyed and families torn apart in the pursuit of profit and control. In 1906, that violence took on a new form inside the Bronx Zoo, within the walls of a modern institution that claimed to celebrate knowledge and nature. Ota Benga was placed in the monkey house, confined to a cage and presented as a curiosity. Visitors were encouraged to see him not as a fellow human being, but as evidence of a distorted idea that some people existed somewhere between animals and humans. This framing did not happen by accident. It echoed the same beliefs that justified human exhibitions across Europe and America, reinforcing the illusion that colonial dominance was natural, rational, and even scientific. Day after day, crowds gathered. They stared, laughed, whispered, and pointed, often without considering what it meant to be watched in silence, stripped of dignity, and reduced to a single, cruel narrative. For Ota Benga, this was not simply public humiliation. It was an erasure of identity. His language, culture, and history were ignored, replaced by a story written by others who held power over his body and his future. Even when protests arose from black clergy and community leaders, the damage had already taken root. His release from the zoo did not mark an end to his suffering, but rather the beginning of a quieter, more isolating struggle. Attempting to adapt to a society that had already defined him through prejudice, Ota Benga found himself caught between worlds. He altered his appearance, changed his habits, and tried to fit into an environment that demanded assimilation while offering little acceptance in return. The same society that once displayed him as entertainment now regarded him with suspicion and distance, unable or unwilling to see beyond the image it had helped create. Isolation became a constant companion. Opportunities were limited, relationships were fragile, and the memory of the cage followed him like a shadow. The trauma of being treated as less than human, combined with the earlier destruction of his family and homeland, weighed heavily on his sense of belonging. What makes his story especially haunting is not only the cruelty he endured, but the ordinary setting in which it occurred: a modern city, a public institution, a crowd of everyday people who believed they were simply observing something unusual. In 1916, after years of displacement and emotional pain, Ota Benga's life came to an end. His death was not the result of a single moment, but the culmination of repeated dehumanization, loss, and abandonment. Within the broader history of human zoos, his story exposes the human cost hidden behind polished exhibitions and confident claims of progress. It forces us to confront a troubling truth: that cruelty does not always announce itself loudly, and that the most lasting harm often comes from systems that deny humanity while pretending to educate. What made stories like Ota Benga's possible was not only cruelty or ignorance, but an entire system of ideas that dressed prejudice in the language of reason. As human exhibitions spread across zoos, fairs, and circuses, they were supported by theories that claimed to explain why such treatment was acceptable, even necessary. So, these ideas presented themselves as science, yet their true purpose was to protect power, justify domination, and silence moral doubt. During the 19th and early 20th centuries, social Darwinism gained popularity by misusing Charles Darwin's work on natural selection. Instead of describing biological processes in nature, it was reshaped into a social doctrine that ranked human societies as if they were competing species. Those who held wealth, technology, and military strength were labeled advanced, while colonized peoples were framed as less developed. In this narrative, inequality was not a moral failure but a natural outcome, and suffering was reinterpreted as proof of weakness rather than evidence of injustice. This belief allowed audiences to look at cages in zoos or stages in circuses and convince themselves they were witnessing history's inevitable order. Eugenics took this logic even further. It claimed that human worth could be measured, improved, or eliminated through selective reproduction. Physical features, cultural differences, and social conditions were falsely treated as signs of biological value. These ideas found eager supporters in universities, political institutions, and popular media, giving them an authority that was rarely questioned by the public. Once a group was defined as biologically inferior, their exclusion, exploitation, and even destruction could be portrayed as rational policy rather than cruelty. Racial studies, often presented with charts, measurements, and complex terminology, played a crucial role in reinforcing these beliefs. Skulls were measured, faces compared, and intelligence tests designed with built-in bias were used to produce predictable results. When the data supported existing hierarchies, it was celebrated as proof. When it did not, it was dismissed or quietly ignored. Science, which should have been a tool for understanding humanity, became a mirror reflecting the fears and ambitions of those who controlled it. Within this framework, slavery and colonialism were no longer seen as acts of violence, but as civilizing missions. The forced labor of millions, the destruction of cultures, and the display of human beings as curiosities could be reframed as progress. Human zoos, in particular, served as visual confirmation of these theories. Visitors did not need to read academic papers. They were invited to see the supposed evidence with their own eyes. A person in a cage, stripped of context and dignity, became a living exhibit designed to reinforce a false hierarchy. What makes this history especially unsettling is how ordinary it appeared to those who lived through it. Families visited exhibitions on weekends, newspapers advertised them openly, and respected institutions endorsed them. The language of science provided comfort, assuring society that these practices were not cruel but enlightened. In reality, this was science distorted by bias, used to silence empathy and erase individual humanity. Over time, these pseudo-scientific theories began to collapse under scrutiny. Advances in genetics, anthropology, and medicine revealed that race is not a biological hierarchy, but a social construct, shaped by history rather than nature. The traits once used to divide humanity were shown to have no connection to intelligence, morality, or worth. What remained was the evidence of harm, generations affected by discrimination, trauma carried forward, and stories like Ota Benga's that could no longer be dismissed as unfortunate exceptions. By linking human exhibitions to these false theories, history reveals a crucial lesson. The greatest danger was not a lack of knowledge, but the misuse of knowledge in service of power. When ideas are accepted without question, because they appear scientific or authoritative, they can turn injustice into tradition. Remembering this past forces us to ask not only what people believed, but why they chose to believe it, and how easily morality can be overshadowed when prejudice is given the mask of truth. As the logic of human exhibitions became normalized, it did not remain confined to zoos or world fairs. It flowed naturally into popular entertainment, where curiosity, spectacle, and profit blended into a powerful commercial force. Circuses and traveling shows became moving stages for the same ideas that had placed people behind bars in public institutions. The setting changed, the posters became brighter, and the language more theatrical, but the message remained the same. Some lives could be reduced to attractions for the amusement of others. No figure represents this transformation more clearly than P.T. Barnum, a master of publicity who understood how to turn controversy into currency. Barnum did not invent the exploitation of marginalized people, but he perfected its presentation. He wrapped human suffering in stories of discovery and wonder, convincing audiences they were witnessing something extraordinary rather than participating in humiliation. Under his influence, exhibitions of human difference were no longer framed as scientific demonstrations alone, but as thrilling entertainment for the masses. Within this world, individuals with physical or cognitive disabilities were especially vulnerable. Their bodies and behaviors were exaggerated, renamed, and reshaped into characters that fit popular fantasies. One of the most disturbing examples was William Henry Johnson, a young man born into poverty in the United States, whose life circumstances made him easy to control and impossible to protect. Instead of being seen as a person in need of care and dignity, he was transformed into a spectacle known by names that erased his identity and replaced it with a myth. Marketed as the man-monkey, Johnson was presented as evidence of a supposed evolutionary link between humans and apes. Posters and advertisements claimed scientific endorsement, borrowing authority from the same racial theories that had already justified human zoos. Audiences were told that his appearance proved long-standing beliefs about hierarchy and difference. Even though these claims were built on distortion and deception, the reality of his condition was far more ordinary and far more tragic, rooted in disability and social neglect rather than any imagined connection to evolution. Costumes, staged behavior, and carefully crafted narratives completed the illusion. Johnson was dressed, posed, and instructed to perform in ways that confirmed what spectators expected to see. The truth of his background, his family, and his inner life had no place in the show. What mattered was not who he was, but how convincingly he could be turned into a symbol. In this way, the circus became an extension of the cage, one that traveled from city to city, carrying the same message to ever wider audiences. The popularity of these performances reveals how deeply dehumanization had taken root in everyday culture. Families attended shows without questioning the morality behind them, reassured by the presence of managers, advertisements, and supposed experts. Entertainment softened the cruelty, making it easier to accept. Laughter replaced reflection, and curiosity drowned out compassion. By paying for a ticket, spectators became participants in a system that thrived on inequality. What connects these circus exhibitions to the earlier stories of human zoos and pseudo-scientific racism is not only the treatment of individuals like William Henry Johnson, but the underlying belief that difference could be owned, displayed, and sold. The same ideas that placed Ota Benga in a zoo cage found new life under the big tent, proving that exploitation adapts easily when society allows it. Looking back, these performances stand as a reminder that injustice does not always appear in obvious forms. Sometimes it arrives dressed as entertainment, smiling and inviting, asking only for attention and applause. The tragedy lies not just in the lives that were consumed by these shows, but in how comfortably the world learned to look away, mistaking spectacle for truth and forgetting that every exhibit was, first and always, a human being. By the time human exhibitions had fully entered the world of popular entertainment, the boundaries between science, spectacle, and exploitation had almost completely disappeared. Within this environment, the story of Julia Pastrana emerged, not as an exception, but as a continuation of the same patterns that had shaped human zoos and circus sideshows. Her life reveals how easily intelligence, talent, and humanity could be overshadowed when difference became a commodity. Julia Pastrana was born in Mexico in the early 19th century. Her early life surrounded by uncertainty and myth. What is known is that she lived with rare genetic conditions that caused excessive hair growth and distinctive facial features. In an era obsessed with classification and hierarchy, her appearance alone was enough to attract attention. Instead of being offered understanding or medical care, she was drawn into a world that saw her body as proof of a false narrative. Managers and promoters presented her as an ape woman, a living symbol of the same imagined evolutionary links that had already been used to justify human exhibitions elsewhere. On stage, Julia was encouraged to reveal her body to satisfy curiosity, yet what the audience rarely expected was her voice, her grace, and her presence. She sang, danced, and spoke multiple languages, performing with a confidence that challenged the story imposed upon her. Journalists who spoke with her often described her as gentle, sociable, and thoughtful, observations that directly contradicted claims that she was less than human. Still, these qualities were inconvenient for the show. They threatened the illusion, and so they were carefully controlled or reinterpreted to fit the spectacle. Medical examinations were arranged not to understand her condition, but to reinforce the narrative that sold tickets. Physicians, limited by the knowledge of their time and influenced by prevailing racial ideas, produced reports filled with errors and speculation. Their words carried authority, and that authority was used to silence doubt. The audience was reassured that what they were seeing was not exploitation, but science and discovery, even as Julia's life was shaped by contracts she did not fully control. Behind the performances was a deep longing for acceptance. Julia read romantic novels and imagined a future where she might be admired for who she was, not what she represented. That longing made her vulnerable to manipulation. When she attempted to leave one manager for another, she was persuaded to stay through promises of affection and partnership, Marriage followed, blurring the line between personal life and performance in a way that left her with little protection. Her pregnancy was presented as yet another spectacle, feeding public fascination rather than concern for her health. When complications arose after childbirth, Julia's life came to an end far from the home she had once known. Yet even death did not free her from exploitation. Her body, along with that of her infant son, was preserved and exhibited across Europe, transformed into objects that continued to generate profit long after her voice had been silenced. The endurance of these exhibitions reveals the depth of society's indifference at the time. Crowds continued to gather, and institutions allowed it to happen, reinforcing the idea that difference justified ownership. Julia Pastrana's story mirrors those of others before her, from zoo cages to circus stages, all connected by the same refusal to recognize full humanity. Today, medical science clearly identifies the conditions Julia lived with and rejects the false theories that once surrounded her. What remains is her story, a reminder that talent and intelligence do not protect against exploitation when prejudice sets the rules. Her life asks us to remember that progress is not measured by spectacle or curiosity, but by the willingness to see dignity where others once saw profit. As the stories of human zoos, circus, exhibitions, and exploited lives come to an end, one truth stands clearly in the light of modern understanding. There was never a missing link. The people once displayed behind bars, on stages, or in posters were never evidence of a half-human past. They were ordinary human beings, born with different appearances, cultures, or medical conditions, and caught in a moment of history that chose cruelty over compassion. Advances in genetics, anthropology, and medicine have since dismantled the theories that once claimed otherwise, proving that race is not a biological hierarchy but a social invention shaped by fear, power, and economic interest. What science has revealed forces us to look back with honesty. Social Darwinism, eugenics, and racial classifications did not fail because they lacked data, but because they were built on false assumptions. They began with conclusions and searched for evidence to support them, rather than seeking truth. When these ideas collapsed, they left behind a trail of damaged lives, families, and cultures. The harm did not end when the exhibitions closed. It echoed through generations in the form of discrimination, inequality, and collective memory. Remembering this history is not about assigning guilt to the present, but about recognizing responsibility. Dehumanization rarely announces itself openly. It often arrives quietly, disguised as science, tradition, or entertainment. Sever's hint. The stories of Ota Banga, William Henry Johnson, Julia Pastrana, and countless unnamed others remind us how easily empathy can be replaced by curiosity, and how quickly difference can be turned into justification for exclusion. Each cage, costume, and performance reflected a choice society made to look without understanding, to believe without questioning. Yet there is meaning in the progress that followed. Modern science now identifies genetic conditions with clarity and respect. Anthropology recognizes the equal complexity of all human cultures. Most importantly, there is a growing awareness that dignity is not granted by appearance, intelligence, or conformity, but is inherent to being human. This understanding does not erase the past, but it gives us the tools to confront it honestly. The true lesson of this history lies in what we choose to carry forward. Progress is not measured only by technology or knowledge, but by the moral decisions that shape how we treat one another. Remembering these stories challenges us to question narratives that divide, to resist explanations that rank human worth, and to remain vigilant when authority claims that inequality is natural or inevitable. Thank you for staying with this story until the end. If this journey has helped you see history, science, and humanity from a deeper perspective. Please consider supporting the channel by liking this video, subscribing, and turning on notifications. Your support helps keep these important conversations alive, ensuring that the past is not forgotten, and that respect, empathy, and ethical progress remain at the center of our shared future.